Valley Chardonnay. All right, we have our tasting station here. I have with me in front of me a white sheet of paper to properly assess color. A way to take notes. This is the Wine Folly Tasting Journal, and which comes with a little color decoder, which is very handy. And if you are planning on driving, definitely use one of these. A spittoon can be very handy. When you pour yourself some wine, pour yourself about 3 ounces in a proper wine glass. It's a really great way to be able to assess the color properly and swirl the wine and taste the wine and have enough in there to really swish around. All right, let's get started. With tasting, we're really doing 4 things here. We're gonna look at the wine, we're gonna smell the wine, taste the wine, and sort of tie it all together with a conclusion. Having a look at this Napa Valley Chardonnay and taking a look at that color, wow. We have 3 colors to choose from: straw, yellow, or gold, and I really think this is more in the straw realm, and I'm gonna call it medium straw. So I'll write that down in my notes. Next thing, let's take a look at those tears forming on the side of the glass. It really depends on where you are in the world, what this will look like for you, because evaporation, humidity in a room will really affect this, and the temperature will too. The way that it forms tears actually indicates alcohol level in a wine, and if you see a great number of tears forming on the side of the glass, it could mean a higher alcohol level wine. With this, I do see a fair amount of tears forming actually on the side of my glass, making me think it is higher alcohol level, but I'll just keep that in the back of my mind as we run through the rest of the tasting. Let's move on to smell. Now, to me, there's really 2 parts of a smell. First, I'm going to assess the intensity, and then I'm going to move on to finding flavors. All right, did you barely smell wine? Did you absolutely smell wine, but not anything specific? Or was it so intense that you could pick out individual flavors? This wine, I wrote down medium intensity, but I don't know what I was thinking. I think it's a high intensity wine because I can pick out individual flavors immediately. Next, let's find some flavors. My challenge to you, let's try to find 5 flavors. A few fruit flavors is good, maybe some other flavors. You get flowers, herbs, spice, earth flavors. Let's write those down. Try to get up to 5 if you can with this wine. You can pause me now because I'm going to do it and start rattling off flavors in a moment. All right, wow. This wine smells like passion fruits, like sweet, green but sweet passion fruit smell. That's what I get in this wine. Second flavors, I could pick out yellow apple or maybe fresh cut pineapple, like more of a green, fresh pineapple than an overripe one. And then underneath those really intense, bold fruit aromas, I get this subtle smokiness that comes through. I almost want to say it's a little bit cheesy. It's mushroomy, it's smoky. You get the idea. Let's head on to the tasting. You're going to ask yourself first, is this wine sweet or is it dry? How acidic is this wine? What is the texture on the palate? Does it really is it oily? Is it sparkly? And then move yourself through that flavor profile. Can you feel the alcohol in the back of your throat? All right, let's do it. Wow, this wine has a lot of flavor. Is this wine sweet or is it dry? To me, this is a dry wine, maybe not bone dry. Next, acidity. Does your mouth tingle? How much does it tingle in the palate when you're tasting this wine? To me, wow, I get a really big burst of acidity right up front, and then it even tingles on the finish a bit. So I wonder, the acidity seems relatively high in this wine in particular. Body-wise, does this wine fill your palate with all the flavors in the world, or is it just like pointillized and barely there down the center of your palate? I would say it is a pretty intense wine. It just goes everywhere on my palate. Although it is a white wine, so it does taste lighter than nearly every single red wine that I've had. So I'm gonna put it at medium minus boldness, but I am noting that it is one of the bigger white wines that I have tasted. Alcohol-wise, that feeling in the back of your throat that you get. Do you get a fair amount of alcohol? You know what's interesting? Even though this wine says it's 14% alcohol, I don't feel that alcohol when I taste this wine and I swallow a little bit. It is barely there. It feels very integrated into the general boisterous, bold flavor of this wine. So there you have it. Those are some notes on the texture. Now let's talk about some of these other things that are going on in this wine, because I think it's interesting before we just close out. Talking about the taste profile, it kind of starts here, it explodes, and it ends somewhere else. If you want to do a little test, take a sip of the wine, breathe in with your mouth and out through your nose, and you can actually activate your retronasal passage and smell the wine in through your palate. So let's give that a try really quick. Do you smell different smells coming through the retronasal passage? I certainly do. I get more green flavors in this wine, more lean green notes, and I also have this sort of subtle creaminess on the back of my palate that I can taste. It's kind of weighty, heavy. It's almost like lemon curd on the back of my palate. So there you have it. We've sort of described this wine from front to back, from start to finish, and all the way around. We have a lot going on in this class. This is a very unique Chardonnay, and I want to talk a little bit more about Chardonnay in Napa Valley and what is going on with this wine that makes it so intriguing. So while you're sipping that Chardonnay, let's talk a little bit more about Chardonnay in the Napa Valley and Chardonnay in general. So Chardonnay is a widely planted grape. It grows all over the world, and where it originally came from is Burgundy in France. Now, the climates where Chardonnay grows well tend to range between just on the verge of cool climate into warm climate. And if we look at Burgundy, where it grows, the average temperature in Burgundy versus Napa Valley, the average growing season temperature there, we'll see that Napa's a lot warmer. So what we've come to learn about tasting, especially in blind tastings, is that Chardonnay exhibits different fruit flavors depending on the climate it grows in. So those cooler climates tend to exhibit flavors such as quince, green apple, and maybe even citrus fruits, whereas in warmer climates, Chardonnay will have more yellow apple flavors, mango, and even pineapple-like notes. So that's something to keep in mind when you're tasting Chardonnay and you're not exactly sure where it's from. That climate style in the primary fruit flavors of the wine will actually come through and give you a clue. Now, beyond those flavors of fruit that we get in Chardonnay, there's another thing going on that is definitely worth note. Chardonnay is one of the few grape varieties that's bold enough and intense enough to handle some oak aging, and this creates a whole swath of different flavors that Chardonnay might have. There are actually two processes going on in oak, and one is oak flavors added to wine, and the other is a process of acid conversion that happens that changes the texture and adds additional flavors. So talking about oak flavors, when we have fresh, brand new toasted oak barrels, they'll actually imbue flavors into the wine. And in Chardonnay, I find those flavors tend to range from caramel and butterscotch to creme brulee and vanilla and even coconut. Now, this other process that happens, it usually happens while the wine is aging in oak barrels, it's called malolactic fermentation. And this is where a little bacteria will actually eat up the malic acid and poop out lactic acid and creates an additional set of compounds which add creaminess to the wine. You might get flavors of butter or creme brulee, lemon curd, or even yogurt-like aromas. Now, if we're talking about the wine and the tasting, this was a bit of a quandary for me because this wine exhibited very little oak flavors in general. And yet, if you look up the aging notes, you will notice that it is aged in 60% used and 40% new oak. So I called Gurgitch Hills, and I was like, what the heck is going on with your Chardonnay? I don't understand it. And here's what they told me. They said, yes, they absolutely ferment in oak. It adds body and texture, which it definitely does. And they also said that when they age the wine, they age it in low toast barrels. So their barrels have been burned very little, and less burning means less flavor addition of these caramel-like notes, these oak lactones that get into the wine. Another thing they told me about this wine is it did not go through malolactic fermentation. And that's why we got all those bright, spritey flavors of acidity in that particular wine. So Napa Valley Chardonnay, this is Napa Valley's most important wine grape. It takes up 14% of the vineyards, which is about 6,100 acres. You're gonna find those two styles there, an oaked and buttery style, and a no oaked or less oaked and no mallow style as well. Make sure you read the tasting notes if you're trying to find your particular style of Chardonnay. If you like that acidity, that spritey style in your Napa Valley Chardonnay, definitely look for wines from vineyards towards the south of the region. You see, in the southern part of Napa Valley, it's a lot cooler than the more northern parts, and that is because of the influence of the San Pablo Bay. For example, in Napa Valley proper, the average growing season temperature is about 65 degrees right now. And in Los Carneros, one of the premier appellations for Napa Valley Chardonnay, by the way, it is just 61 degrees during the growing season. So the history of Chardonnay in Napa Valley and in California is actually quite cool. We have first documented history of Chardonnay coming into California during the 1880s, so a long time ago. There were a few dudes bringing the grapes in. We've got Charles Wetmore, Ernst Wente, and this guy named Paul Mason. So Ernest Wente went and got grapes from Montpellier, which is not in Burgundy, but Paul Mason went to Burgundy, to Meursault, and got clippings in Meursault and brought those into California, into Santa Cruz Mountains, in his Mount Eden vineyard. Of course, Chardonnay got an early start and people were super excited about it, but plantings dropped off and people started ripping it out throughout Prohibition. And now this wasn't necessarily because of Prohibition directly, because we were still growing grapes at that time. But the problem was we needed to ship those grapes to the East Coast where the primary population of America was. And Chardonnay just didn't make the trip. So we started planting richer, bolder, more structured grapes, red grapes predominantly, so that we could actually ship them back to the East Coast where people would make basement wines during Prohibition. So we started to see a resurgence in Chardonnay with planting starting again in 1946, after the war. And there is some concrete evidence of the Wente clone, remember that Montpellier clone, being planted at Stony Hill Vineyards and at Mayacamas and at Inglenook. These are some of the old classic wineries in Napa Valley. And that's when Chardonnay started to pick up in popularity again. More and more new producers were planting this grape, and it was the genius of one British man by the name of Stephen Spurrier to put Napa Valley wines head to head with the best of the best in France. And he organized a tasting in 1976 with a few young producers in the Napa Valley against the best of the best from Burgundy and Bordeaux. And you know what happened? The 1973 vintage of Chateau Montelena Chardonnay, which was made by Mike Gurgitch, won. It had the most points of every single wine in that tasting. By the way, if you're trying to figure it out, Mike Gurgitch in Gurgitch Hills, this is his winery. You might get tested on all of those things, but I found myself going into a realm of unknown when I was researching this particular Chardonnay. When I called up the winery and asked them about it, they told me that the clone was Clone 27. And the reason this was important is because it had these flavors of passion fruit, which I don't normally associate with many Chardonnays. And passion fruit is derived from a chemical compound group called thiols. styles can taste anywhere from like burnt, gross garlic to beautiful, delicious passion fruit. And what they told me was that clone 27 was a Wente clone. So I looked up clone 27 in the UC Davis database to try to figure out what was going on, and it told me that clone 27 was clone 1 from Mount Eden Vineyards. And if you can remember, Paul Mason was the guy who originally planted Mount Eden. So were they right? Is it a Wente clone that delivers these fresh passion fruit flavors? Or was it potentially an original clone from Burgundy, France that was brought into California in the 1880s? I don't know the answer to that. So you won't be tested on that, but that is a fun geeky fact you can know about Chardonnay in the Napa Valley. I hope you had a lot of fun tasting Chardonnay. Let's move on to the next wine.